Well, thank you for joining this webinar. Today we'll be looking at how we go about assessing finance sector action on deforestation, and specifically looking at the 2022 Forest 500 methodology as it relates to financial institutions. My name's Josh Brewer. I am a Sustainable Finance Associate here at Global Canopy. I'll be moderating the discussion today, and I'm really pleased. I'm joined by a fantastic panel. So we have Danielle Carreira, Head of Finance Sector Engagements at the Tropical Forest Alliance, Sarah Draper, Corporate Performance Program Manager here at Global Canopy, and Emma Thompson, who's the lead on Forest 500 at Global Canopy. So if we just take a quick look at today's agenda. So I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping in a minute. Then Danny will do a sort of kind of introduction and context setting. Sarah will then take us through what is Forest 500, maybe talk about it in kind of the wider terms. And then Emma will do much more of a deep dive into the methodology and looking at how financial institutions will be assessed. And then we'll just come back to Sarah on Forest 500 company assessments. And then we'll finish with the Q&A. Now, as just a little bit of housekeeping, this session is being recorded. The recording will be shared with you afterwards. Today, we'll be using the Q&A box to collate questions. I think it's what the real value in this session is if we can get a bit of a conversation going. So please do put your questions into there. If you could use the Q&A box rather than the chat, that would be much appreciated. Yeah, just before we get going today, I thought we would just have a little bit of a quick poll just to take a temperature of the participants. So this is an anonymous poll, and really it's mostly directed to the financial institutions, but if you are not a financial institution, then maybe you could try and answer this on behalf of the organizations that you're engaging with or working with. And so it's looking really at what stage you feel you are in terms of addressing deforestation in your portfolios. Are you starting out? You're just trying to collect some information, make sense of what's out there in terms of initiatives and tools? Are you learning? Are you sort of information gathering on deforestation and the associated risks? Are you developing? You know, you might actually be assessing your own deforestation risk or in the process of creating your own deforestation-free policy. Or, you know, are you actually at the stage where you're implementing? You have a policy on deforestation-free portfolios, and you're looking to put that into place. So if everyone could go ahead and just vote on that now, and then we'll just take a little look at the results before we get going. And just whilst everyone's voting, I just thought it'd be useful to give a little bit of context for the webinar. So, you know, obviously we ask companies to be transparent so that we can assess them. And having thought about this a bit, it's only fair, we think, that we're transparent in our assessment process. And that enables, you know, the companies are being assessed to ask any questions that you've got through this webinar. So it's just an opportunity to do that. And we thought it was just in the interest of being open and transparent, it made sense to do that. Okay, I think the poll is closed now. So should we take a little look at that results? Unsurprisingly, we have a kind of standard bell curve there. So we've got, you know, the middle sections, learning and developing, where we have the most activity, and then we kind of on the outer edges. Interesting, actually, that the lowest number is starting out, and actually we have pretty good numbers on implementing. So that's very promising. That's great. Okay, well, I think time to get going. Danielle, if you could just talk to us, give us an introduction on why financial institutions should act on deforestation and sort of ongoing initiatives related to that.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you all for inviting me to attend this session today, to speak at the session today. It's a huge pleasure. I think, as Josh mentioned, I'm the head of finance sector engagement at the Tropical Forest Alliance. And for those who are not familiar, the TFA is a network that brings together partners around the common goal of implementing solutions to tackle deforestation resulting from commercial activities in tropical forest areas. We are hosted by the World Economic Forum, and we work with governments, private sector, and civil society across several regions and countries. To name a few, We have team in Brazil, in Peru, Colombia, Argentina, Paraguay, Indonesia, China, and well, just to name a few of them. And I joined the team back in 2020, and I'm now responsible for the development and implementation of the initiatives which the financial sector are involved. And it's been a very long journey. I think I started my work with the finance sector nearly 10 years ago on deforestation issues. And I have to admit that it's very encouraging to see the level of sophistication of the conversation and the actions nowadays. A decade ago, I think if I look back, very few actors understood the importance of forests for the health of our planet and of our economy and society. And I think thanks to the work of many out there, and I'm gonna flag here Global Canopy especially, leading financial institutions now understand that by addressing deforestation, you will be addressing major challenges that our society faces, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, food security, and several human rights issues that are linked to it. I think to put that into a bit more of a practical context, we see, and I'm going to be talking a lot about Brazil here. Unfortunately, Brazil is not on the good books at the moment as far as deforestation goes. I'm also Brazilian, so very close to my heart, the issue. But we see that the lack of rainfall and the loss of biodiversity caused by deforestation in the southern Amazon region is already creating a drop in the productive and revenue for Brazilian agribusiness. It is estimated that the loss, if deforestation levels are maintained, will reach up to $1 billion per year by 2050, according to a study of UFMG. Looking from a climate lens, emissions from land use represent approximately 25% of global emissions. Again, if we look at Brazil, approximately 50% of the total emissions in the country is linked to deforestation. So for all the financial institutions, all the companies which have committed to a net zero target, you can certainly not meet your goal unless you address deforestation. And I would like to make it really clear here that I don't believe the problem will be solved by stopping production of certain commodities. We don't have to do that, choose one or the other. We can increase commodity production without further land conversion. Again, bringing a little bit to life here, the Cerrado. Cerrado is a biome next to the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, and it represents 55% of Brazil beef production, 35% of the country's total pasture land, of which 63% is degraded. And to meet the increased demand for soy, we need 7 million hectares expansion to 2030. But the good news is that we already have 18 million hectares suitable land to increase soy production on these degraded lands. Of course, it comes with a price, and we require 9 billion investment until 2030 for the expansion to take place in already degraded lands. So in addition to redirecting capital, we also need long-term commitments and collective action. It should be a shared responsibility, as producers alone should not and cannot absorb all the costs and risks. They are already absorbing a lot of the risks. Agriculture, as we all know, is a highly risky sector. And I think on that note, on that aspect, I believe that something that needs to be celebrated, and as I said, I think the agenda has been moved a lot, the awareness has increased a lot. So I think we need to celebrate a letter that was published at COP26. It was signed by 33 financial institutions at the time, and they all committed to their best efforts to address deforestation issues and hopefully achieve a deforestation-free portfolio linked to the production of these high-risk commodities by 2025. Will be easy? Of course not. There is not an easy solution for a complex problem. And for deforestation and more broadly land conversion across the globe is an extremely complex issue to be resolved. I've been saying for many years now, I feel like a parrot repeating that, but I don't think deforestation is the E of ESG. Yes, it includes the S and the G, and I would add a few other. It's also an economical and a cultural challenge, and today, as we know, is also a political problem. So I think these leading financial institutions, which made this public commitment, have stepped up their efforts, are working together because they understand that we need to find a solution and we need to be fast if we are to thrive as a society. As I mentioned, it won't be easy, but only by understanding and leading with the problem is that you can identify data, framework, regulations that are required to solve this challenge. On that note, again, I would like to thank Global Canopy for its leadership. This organization that has been working on this agenda for over a decade and provided much needed information to key stakeholders and of course, interested key stakeholders. Today, I think it's a huge pleasure to be here because as based on the feedback of users of the data and consequently an increasing understanding of the issue by many, they will be presenting the updated methodology. So I hope you all enjoy the session and use the data and provide feedback because that's how we're going to move the agenda. I think to finalize, I would like to make you all aware that the before mentioned letter, it is still open and investors that would like to join this journey and work in partnership with leading financial institutions are welcome to contact me or the Global Canopy team to learn more about it. And remember that lack of action is only increasing the financial risks to your portfolios. You are also missing an opportunity to support a much needed transition of the agricultural sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for that call to action and to your kind words about Global Canopy. And I think it's also, we need to recognize the many years of work you've done in this sector and everything you've done to push forward this agenda as well. And I think it's a really key point that is a complex area, but we are now moving into a more sophisticated period of engagement. It's not just biodiversity, it's climate change, it's human rights, but it's also potential financial impacts as well. So it's financial materiality. So thank you for highlighting that. Okay, now I'd just like to move across to Sarah, who'd talk a bit more about Forest 500 and what it is.
Thanks, Josh. Forest 500 started in 2014 to hold companies and financial institutions accountable to their voluntary deforestation commitments. So it was around that time that a lot of organizations were signing up to collective agreements to tackle deforestation. These include the New York Declaration on Forests, the Consumer Goods Forum Deforestation Resolution, and there was also the Banking Environment Initiative, Soft Commodities Compact, where those that signed up committed to helping the Consumer Goods Forum companies in their goal. So we started Forest 500 to bring accountability to those companies exposed to deforestation and track how they were doing against these global goals of tackling deforestation linked to commodity production. Forest 500 first identifies and then ranks the most important players in supply chains linked to deforestation. We select 350 companies and 150 financial institutions that have the greatest influence, as identified by their exposure to deforestation risk. And Forest 500 is funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and previously the Department for International Development. Next slide, please. So we select the Forest 500 every 2 years, starting by identifying the 350 companies. To inform our selection of companies, we first identify the tropical countries with the greatest forest loss since 2010. And in our 2022 selection, the countries we identified represent 96% of tropical deforestation. We then identify the countries that are importing the largest value of each forest risk commodity in the last 2 years from those countries. And we end up with a list of key producing and trading countries for these commodities, which then guides our selections of key companies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we use that list of countries to guide our identification of the biggest players in the supply chains of palm oil, soy, cattle products, so beef and leather, and timber products, including pulp and paper. All companies that are selected to be in the Forest 500 are based on their exposure to at least one of these commodities, but they'll be assessed on their actions for all of the 6 commodities they're exposed to through their supply chains. Next slide, please. We select companies at each stage of the supply chain, from producers through to traders through to retailers. We use different data and metrics depending on which commodity and segment of the supply chain we're looking at and the data availability. But this we can use things like land bank area owned, or market share of relevant markets, or volume of commodity handled. We review the sample every other year to make sure that we're capturing any changes in the market and continue to include the most influential power brokers within our assessments. Next slide, please. Once we have identified the companies, we then identify the 150 financial institutions which provide the most finance to those 350 companies, either through shareholdings, loans and underwritings, or bond holdings. Our 2022 selection shows the 150 financial institutions are providing $7.1 trillion in financing to the 350 companies we've selected as the most exposed to deforestation risk. So this year, we have 36 new financial institutions that have been identified and added to the Forest 500 selection. Next slide, please. Due to their broad exposure to different sectors, and also their exposure indirectly through other financial institutions, we assess financial institutions for all of the commodities: palm oil, soy, cattle products, and timber products. And again, this selection is reviewed every other year to ensure we capture any changes in the financing of the key companies and continue to track those financial institutions with the greatest influence. Once we have our selection of these 500 organizations, we assess each of the companies and financial institutions annually on the strength and implementation of their commitments and policies of deforestation and associated human rights issues, which we will cover in much more detail in a bit. But back to you, Josh.
Thank you, Sarah. Right, I think what we'll do is we'll just take an opportunity to put a couple of questions out at this point. So firstly, if I have a question for you, Sarah, why doesn't Forest 500 look at cocoa or coffee as commodities?
Thanks, Josh. It's a great question. So obviously we're looking at 500 organizations, so we do have to prioritize which ones we're looking at and what we're assessing. So the commodities that we have chosen are those that cause the most tropical deforestation globally. We definitely recognize that, for instance, coffee and cocoa can drive more deforestation in particular regions, but if we're looking at a global level, we've prioritized those that drive the greatest amount.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And actually, Danny, if I just come back to you, you were talking about the collective commitment to eliminate agricultural commodity-driven deforestation. You know, if I was a financial institution, what's in it for me to sign up to the letter? Why would I want to do that?
What is not there for you? I think is more the question you should be asking. As I said, I think it's really important. I think from a climate perspective, you know, we are seeing all these financial institutions with their net zero commitments, but I think the most important aspect of that letter, as I mentioned, I've been working with the financial sector for many years. We've seen investors issuing letters asking for companies for more data. We've seen investors sending letters asking for regulations. And for the first time, we saw a letter that the investors themselves committed to do something. And as I said, not something easy. They are now working together to address all the challenges. We hear a lot to know the data issue. We don't have enough data. But what data do they need? If they want to address the issue, they need to understand the data that they need. If they don't understand the problem, they can't identify the data. So I think this group, has been signed by leading financial institutions, some of them which have been working on this agenda for many years with myself, since my time back at PRI in 2012, when we set up the Palm Oil Investor Working Group. So I think the opportunity for them to join their peers and try to find a solution for this big problem that we have is unique. And behind that, we are, as a group, Global Canopy, Conservation International, High Level Champions, Nature for Climate, and I'm forgetting someone here. Sarah, help me. I think ourselves, TFA, we are supporting these investors to implement their commitments as well. So I think there is a lot of support, there is a lot of collaboration, and we're trying to coordinate with existing initiatives. So there is a lot for FIs who would like to sign this letter. I think who doesn't sign is missing.
Okay, thank you. I'm convinced, so I'll sign.
Thank you, Josh.
And, yeah, and I'd just like to, on your point about data, I mean, the data is available. That's what Global Canopy does. So Forest 500 is one example of that data, particularly around portfolio risk. But in terms of looking for engagement, we have very, very high quality, deep data in the form of the trace data as well that can be used to engage with traders. So yes, come and talk to us about data.
Yes, and I think just to flag, I think there is a lot of good data out there. I think if I step myself into the financial institution shoes, we need more coverage. Yes, these 500 companies, investors are exposed to a much larger volume. But again, if they don't ask, they're not going to get it. So I think that is the important step, because it is the first step. There is enough data out there for them to start understanding and addressing the issue. They can start engaging with companies, they can start engaging with policymakers, they can start engaging with the data providers. They need to start from somewhere, and we have enough to start.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, Danny. Now, all this talk of data, I think it's time to move across to Emma, who will take us on a deep dive onto the methodology itself. So over to you, Emma.
Josh, and thank you to all of you for joining us today to hear more about the Forest 500 methodology for the 2022 assessment period. To get the basics out of the way, the 2022 financial institution assessments will begin in July and are scheduled to run through September to early October. And anything that you publish on your website during that time will be taken into account in your assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Sarah mentioned, we assess all 350 companies and 150 financial institutions annually on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation and associated human rights abuses. We use two different methodologies to do this, one for companies, which assesses them on the commitments they've made for their exposure through their supply chains, and one for financial institutions, which assesses them on the policies they have in place to require their clients and holdings to address deforestation risk. Both of our methodologies assess against best practice for the sector. And this year, as of 2022, our financial institution assessment methodology is now aligned with the finance sector roadmap on eliminating commodity-driven deforestation. And that roadmap has been endorsed by and aligned with the accountability framework, which defines the best practice for companies operating in forest risk supply chains. And our financial institution methodology can also be mapped to some of the key points on the COP26 commitment letter that Danny and Josh were talking about earlier. All of our assessments are done using publicly available information. So anything that the companies and financial institutions have published on their websites is taken into account in their assessments. But this year, for the first time, we will be providing all companies and all financial institutions that are assessed with access to a form through which they can inform the Forest 500 assessment team of any documents or policies that have been newly published during the assessment period. The link shared via that form must be publicly accessible. Any privately reported information will not be considered in the assessment. And all financial institutions which are being assessed have all been informed already, but will be sent the link to that form in the coming days. We also work with a team of language consultants to ensure that the assessments are conducted in the native language of the country where the financial institution is headquartered, as well as in English. And then each year, once we've completed the assessments, we publish our entire data set on our website at forest500.org. And this year, we will be publishing that data in the first quarter of 2023. Here, all of the assessment data we collect is accessible, including scores, quotes, and links to the policies. It's available to view, but also to download. Next slide, please. As you can see on the screen, our methodology has 4 key sections. We have the overall approach, which looks at the high-level action of the financial institution and what they're doing to address deforestation. Then we have policy strength, which looks at the strength and scope of policies applied to clients and holdings related to deforestation and traceability. We then have associated human rights, which assesses on whether the financial institution has policies in place to require clients or holdings to address critical human rights issues in forest risk supply chains, including labor rights, customary rights to land, resources and territory, and free, prior and informed consent. And then finally, we have the implementation and reporting section. This section looks at how financial institutions are communicating about the implementation of their policies and their implementation in their portfolios, and also whether they're following the best practice processes to ensure effective implementation, including monitoring and engagement processes. Next slide, please. And here you can see the breakdown of these different sections and how they add up to make a financial institution's total score. A financial institution receives a commodity-specific score for each commodity and also a total score. So as you can see, overall approach is assessed once per financial institution, and it's worth 10% of their total score. And as we mentioned earlier, financial institutions are assessed on the 4 highest risk commodities, so cattle products, soy, palm oil, and timber products. And for each commodity, we assess financial institutions on the strength of their policies on deforestation and human rights, and then also on implementation and reporting. Financial institutions' score on implementation and reporting represents 35% of their total score, and that's as we shift the focus of our scoring from setting policies to implementing them effectively. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to run through some of the indicators which will be included in the 2022 Financial Institution Assessment Methodology. I will not be going through all of the indicators, but I will highlight some of the newly added indicators and some of the highest scoring ones for each section of our methodology. But the full assessment methodology is now available online on our website, and we will put the link to the chat at the end of this webinar. So starting with the overall approach, this section looks at how the organization is addressing deforestation across the entire organization. So looking for an overarching policy or commitment to address deforestation or conversion of natural ecosystems in their portfolio, which is applicable to all of the organization's financing activities and exposure. We also look to see if the organization recognizes deforestation, conversion, or associated human rights abuses as a business risk to the institution itself. And we also record whether that is regulatory, financial, or reputational, for instance. And then one of the new indicators in this section this year is whether the financial institution is involved in any collaborative sector initiatives on deforestation or is involved in any advocacy for legislation on deforestation, like the EU or the UK due diligence legislation, for example. Next slide, please. So moving on to policy strength, which, as we noted earlier, this is now assessed once for each of 4 commodities. There are 6 indicators in this section, but I'm just going to highlight 3 of them. Firstly is indicator 2.1, which looks for the financial institution to have a commodity-specific policy on deforestation or conversion. To score for this indicator, the policy must mention the name of the commodity. It doesn't have to be a specific policy for a specific document for deforestation policy, but it must meet the scoring criteria for this indicator. Organizations can score for policies to protect priority forests or using credible certification schemes, all the way up to zero gross deforestation or zero gross conversion. And the scores for this indicator increase based on the strength of the policy. One of the changed indicators this year is 2.3, which looks to whether the financial institution requires clients or holdings to trace their commodities back to a point in the supply chain where they can guarantee compliance or require them to monitor compliance. This indicator is not about just setting a standard for clients or holdings, but also requiring them to evidence its implementation. And then one final indicator to run through for this section, as you can see, is whether the financial institution requires its clients or holdings to have specified an organization-wide cutoff date for deforestation or conversion, and that is using the accountability framework's definition of a cutoff date. Next slide, please. Moving on to associated human rights. So previously, this section of our methodology was called social considerations, but we have renamed it this year. An effective approach to deforestation or conversion must also address human rights abuse risks and impacts. The 2 issues are very closely linked and they must be treated as such. In this section of the methodology, we have added several new indicators in addition to making existing 2021 indicator scoring. I'm going to talk through 4, and these are the 4 that are fundamental in an approach to deforestation as defined by the finance sector roadmap. So one of these indicators is about requiring clients or holdings to test for the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities and crucially not proceeding with any new interests or developments unless that consent has been given. We also assess whether clients or holdings are required to have a labour rights policy. This policy must include for human rights specifically, or for labour rights specifically, sorry, the right to have freedom of association and the right to be free from forced labour, child labour and discrimination. The next indicator, 2.12, was an indicator in 2021, which has now been strengthened and also made scoring for the 2022 assessments. This is all about requiring clients or holdings to respect the customary rights to land, resources and territory of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and to refrain from acquiring any land until existing conflicts have been resolved. And then the final one I wanted to highlight today in this section is a new indicator on requiring clients or holdings to have a zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land and human rights defenders. Next slide, please. I just quickly wanted to touch on the scope indicators. So for each of the indicators in the policy strength and associated human rights section, we assess the scope of each policy. So looking at, does the policy apply to all of the financial institutions' operations and financial services provided, to all deals regardless of size or value, and all clients and holdings regardless of their size? We have also made a small change to indicator 3.4, which includes the addition of a scoring option of financiers in addition to all segments of the commodity supply chain from producers through to retailers. Only financial institutions which are able to provide finance to banks will be assessed on this answer option. And this is about which stages of the supply chain this policy covers. So all scores for this indicator will be weighted equally to ensure they always add up to 3. Next slide, please. And on to the final section of indicators that I wanted to talk through today, which are in our implementation and reporting section. We have added several new indicators to this section of the methodology as part of the alignment with the finance sector roadmap, including whether the financial institution conducts a risk assessment at the point of onboarding any new or prospective clients or holdings, which is also a key point in the COP26 commitment letter. We also, as you can see, assess whether financial institutions have an ongoing monitoring and due diligence process to monitor compliance of their clients or holdings with their standards, and also whether they have an engagement process in place and what that engagement looks like. And the final indicator I wanted to go through today is on reporting. So whether the financial institution annually reports 3 key criteria. So these criteria are detailed in the assessment methodology, which is online, but it includes the number or proportion of clients and holdings that the deforestation policy applies to, the number or proportion of clients or holdings which are compliant with the policy or their time-bound plans to meet the policy, and finally, how many clients or holdings have been engaged with on the topic of deforestation. To score for this indicator, this must be reported annually. So that is it for me for now. And as I said, the full methodology is online at forest500.org, and we will post the link in the chat. But I will now hand over to Sarah to go through our company assessments in a bit of detail as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Next slide, please. So we also just wanted to briefly take you through the update to our 2022 company assessment methodology and highlight some of the ways that you can use our assessments of companies in your processes. Next slide, please. The company methodology has the same structure as the financial institution assessment methodology, with those same 4 sections that Emma has just talked through. So here you can see the breakdown of these sections and how they add up to make a company's total score. The company receives a commodity specific score for each of the commodities they're assessed for and a total score. As we mentioned earlier, companies are assessed for each commodity they're exposed to through their supply chains. So for some, that might be just 1 commodity, and for others, it might be all 6. For each commodity, we assess companies on the content of their commitments, the strength of their commitments on associated human rights, and finally, the implementation and reporting against those commitments. The company's score on implementation and reporting represents 56% of their total score this year, which we wanted to make sure was to reflect the importance of focusing on the implementation of commitments and not simply the content of what they are committing to. For commodities where a company is the power broker, more of their total score is made up by those key commodities. So it's weighted twice as much as those other commodities where they are less heavily involved in the supply chains. Next slide, please. So there are lots of ways that Forest 500 data can be useful to you and to companies as well, but we're just going to focus on 3 examples in particular today. So firstly, the data could be used to identify high-risk clients or holdings or suppliers. Each company and financial institution in the Forest 500 has been identified as having the greatest influence on at least one of the 6 high-risk soft commodities. That means that their inclusion is indicative of their exposure to deforestation risk. The selection process, combined with our assessment of the steps that they're taking to mitigate that risk, means that you can use this data in high-level and in-depth risk assessments of your portfolios or suppliers. Next slide, please. The data could also be used by companies and financial institutions to benchmark themselves against others, or by third parties to benchmark them against each other. So the strength and implementation of commitments can be compared between companies and between financial institutions. We can look at indicator level, commodity level, or compare total scores. And within the data, we provide the quotes and links to the commitment or policy for why we gave them that score. So it really enables you to dig really deeply into the detail of what they're doing and what their gaps are, what they're not doing as well. So the final use case, next slide, please. The final use case for the data is a tool for engagement with clients' holdings or suppliers. As the companies and financial institutions are assessed against best practice, where they don't score full points for a specific indicator or a section of the methodology, this highlights a gap in their approach to address deforestation and associated human rights abuses. So this means the methodology can be used to show which actions the company or financial institution could take next to continue to make progress and improve their approach, making it a really useful data set for engagement purposes. If you do have any questions, we will happy to take questions through the Q&A function or over email. We will put the email address in the chat, but I will hand back to Josh. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Emma, both for those deep dives into the methodology itself. So I think really useful to be able to demonstrate the details of the assessments and also about how those assessments can be used and operationalized as tools. So just on to a few questions now. So we've got one that's come in from one, and the question is asking, will we provide guidance on what is considered best practice in the financial sector? Sarah, is that one for you, maybe?
Yeah, we can take that, thank you. So within the Forest 500 methodology, we lay out how we're going to assess the financial institutions. We don't then lay out exactly what we should be expecting financial institutions to be doing or reporting. Although there is quite a lot of detail there, it is helpful to understand how we then look at the quality of the reporting and the commitments and things. But what we do have is we've worked with Danny and the rest of the organisations she mentioned to develop a roadmap for financial institutions to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation. And we can also post the link to that in the chat, which does then lay out the steps that financial institutions need to take. It's fully aligned with the Forest 500 methodology. So if you follow that guidance, that's completely aligned with what we'll then be assessing you on. And it's also aligned with the accountability framework initiatives guidance for companies. So it's matching up with what companies are being asked to do by NGOs as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And Emma, can companies comment on their assessments and feedback on those assessments? So how do we manage that?
Of course, so Forest 500 assessments are based solely on publicly available information. So we do not ask for feedback on the assessment. It is all based on that publicly available information. We do reach out to all of the companies and financial institutions this year to let them know they've been selected. And then every year we do also reach out to them, normally a week before the launch of the data, to let them know that their new score for the Forest 500, and then also on the day of the launch to let them know the link to their assessment on our website. But this year we are also opening this form that I mentioned, where financial institutions and companies can send the Forest 500 assessment team links to newly published or newly updated documents that are relevant to the assessment through just to kind of notify us that a policy has been updated. We do count any information that's published on the website at the time of the assessment. So that would be for financial institutions from July through to September. So anything published in that time would be accepted in the assessment. We do check throughout the assessment period for new policies, but this is just in case anyone would like to notify us. And all assessed financial institutions will be emailed that link over the next few days.
Great, thank you, Emma. And Danny, one for you, I think, here, and just thinking from the perspective of a financial institution that's really coming to this new, you know, and where do they start? What's the best way for them to start engaging in tackling the deforestation exposure that they might have in their portfolios?
I think the roadmap that Sarah mentioned is fantastic. It gives a step-by-step approach on how FIs can start understanding the issue and assessing their exposure. As I said, I think there is a variety of data sources there. I think that to a point makes the problem a little bit more complex for investors because of the variety out there. But I think, as I mentioned, it is very sort of well put together, reviewed, accepted by civil society as well, had a lot of feedback from the financial institutions. I think one thing that is really important to know that throughout the development of the roadmap, we did a vast consultation with civil society, but also the financial institutions, which are leading on this topic. So I think that would be my recommendation. As I mentioned as well, I think this group that is working together with these 5 organizations, we are here to help. We are available to help. There is a collection of initiatives out there. I myself, we are here at TFA coordinating an initiative which is called Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. This is a public policy dialogue between a group of 60 institutional investors from 18 countries that currently represent 8.5 trillion of assets under management. And they've been in dialogue with the Brazilian government, the Indonesian government, and tomorrow we are launching a 3rd working group, which is going to be engagement with the consumer countries, so UK, US, and EU. So there is a lot out there in terms of support for the financial institutions to start their work on that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so no excuses then, so people can.
No, there is no excuse.
Okay. And then just Emma, maybe just time for one last question. Do you find that there are criteria where companies get close but just fall short? And are there certain pieces of information that they could provide that they might already have that would actually get them, move their scores up?
Definitely. So I think a key thing about the Forest 500 assessments is they are based on that publicly available information. So they do really reward transparency, and it is transparency that we need from companies, but also financial institutions to address deforestation. So for instance, some of the examples would be, we have an indicator on anti-corruption policies and abusive tax policies, and also requiring clients or holdings to operate legally. So I'm sure these are things that the financial institutions have policies on, they just might be internal. So it's really about publishing those policies online, making them publicly accessible. And that also really applies to some of the human rights indicators as well, and also kind of net zero commitments too. So all these things that I'm sure are all happening internally and just publishing them on the website, letting everyone else know, but also letting us as the assessment team know so that we can score you on that information.
Great, thank you, Emma. Well, I'm conscious of time. We're pretty much there. So I hope, thank you to Danny and to Sarah and to Emma for your fantastic contributions today. I hope this is really useful to people who joined today's webinar. I think both in terms of demonstrating the importance of dealing with deforestation, but also how to do so, practical tips on what you can do and how you can start to approach that. So yeah, just finish up, say thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you again to the panel. That was great, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.